Hi, I'm Pavio and this is Attention, and today we'll be taking a look at another science fiction author, one that is not usually found in the science fiction sections at your local bookstores, but without question is one of the most well-known sci-fi authors of his time. Even if he himself stated in an essay titled Science Fiction, I have been a sore-headed occupant of a file drawer labeled science fiction, and I would like out, since so many serious critics regularly mistake the drawer for a urinal. That essay was written in 1965, and I for one am curious as to how Kurt Vonnegut would respond, as since 1965 the genre has evolved from a genre full of wonder and imagination to a genre that deals heavily with philosophical thought while maintaining its wonder and imagination, that deals with the human condition not in the direct Hemingway or Virginia Woolf kind of way, but in an indirect way that demands just as much consideration to one's self in the present as it does to the art of escapism. What Kurt Vonnegut managed to do, and was quite successful at it, was write some of the greatest science fiction novels that went undetected as such for many readers and critics. In other words, he did eventually crawl out of that file drawer, but never shook off the smell. Though I do want this to serve as more of an introduction to Kurt Vonnegut's career, I will primarily be talking about Player Piano. His debut novel, as within that novel one will find every Vonnegut theme that will be carried throughout his whole career. But I do plan on putting out a few other videos that deal with his more major works, such as Cat's Cradle, Breakfast of Champions, and maybe one other one that may or may not ring a bell. But to start, we'll jump back in time to 1952, where Kurt Vonnegut would publish his first novel, Player Piano. A novel originally published under the title Utopia 14, with cover art that appealed to the rising science fiction fan base. This is a dystopian novel where the hero Paul Proudus, a wealthy man by inheritance who rebels against his own company, a world in which he is so used to, that being a world that is run by supercomputers, and machines that just typically have taken over almost every aspect of what would make up one's usual working day. The rebelling in which Paul would like to carry out is to settle down on the countryside with his wife that doesn't seem to understand the simple ways in which one can enjoy life. Paul is a very simple man in a very complicated world. But despite its outstanding prose, its very interesting character development, and a story that was just all around ahead of its time, this novel would not spark the attention that Vonnegut would later receive. The novel showed very little interest with the, I believe, one review it had gotten. He admitted in an interview with David Standish, a columnist for Playboy magazine in 1973, that he tried to rip off Huxley's Brave New World, and as he put it, Player Piano was my response to the implications of having everything run by little boxes. While writing the novel, he worked at General Electric and watched the workers punch in and out and having all these machines doing little things. Piano Player is set in America a decade after the United States had won the Third World War. Machines had taken over most people's jobs during the war efforts, and the population is split between two classes. The managers and engineers who live on one side of a river, and on the other side, a side called Homestead, is where everyone else would live, everyone who does not have one of those two titles. The main story follows Paul Proteus, who inherited his father's social status, and is the factory manager at Ilium Works. A parallel story follows the main storyline and tells of the Shah of Bratpur, a character that is in stark contrast to the managers and engineers. Now, without giving too much of the story away, there is the underground rebellion group known as the Ghost Shirt Society, who seem to have plans of their own along with a friend of Paul's, who gives Paul a surprise visit near the beginning of the novel. And though this does feel like your typical dystopian sci-fi, unlike Orwell or Huxley or many of the other science fiction dystopian novels, the characters in Vonnegut's world have kept a side of humanity that is often not portrayed in these other works. Similar characters with a positive humanistic outlook are to be found in all of Vonnegut's works, and they are often placed in situations in which the positive characteristics would justifiably be abandoned. Of course, this is where Vonnegut's black satire shines best. But what does this say about how he viewed humanity's place in the world? And better yet, what does it say about how he himself viewed humanity's place in society? One thing that stood out in every one of his novels, and one thing that he makes clear in interviews and conversations throughout his life, is the importance of community. In his debut novel, Paul Proteus feels disconnected with the people that surround him. Outside of his wife, they are primarily work colleagues who are work-orientated. So much so, to Paul, they function as a part of the machines that have taken over most of the jobs. Surrounded by those whose only intentions are to climb the economic ladder, and a wife who only seems to care about Paul's position in life, he feels more and more trapped by the loneliness that comes with this way of living. All sense of community has been replaced by robotic actions that are expected to be followed. For Vonnegut, this is how the world ends, or at least what humankind has made of the world. However, no matter how far society moves away from this sense of community, Vonnegut recognized something that would remain in the human spirit, a desire to rid itself of loneliness at all costs, even if to do so means to isolate from society. This idea rises from Vonnegut's concern with the feeling of loneliness rather than the action of being alone. As he so often expressed in many of his novels and short stories, some of the most loneliest people were those who were surrounded by others in which they could not relate. Which is one reason in which Paul in Player Piano buys the acreage where he can feel a sense of belonging by simply not belonging anywhere. Throughout Vonnegut's work, the soul of community thrives when all else seems to be lost. This is because Vonnegut did not see community as simply being surrounded by friends or family. Oftentimes when one's friends or family disagree, either politically or have separate standards when it comes to ethical or social issues, that sense of community becomes detached real quick. The soul of community does not rest in who as in a sense of title, but who in the sense of sharing like-minded ideas. For Vonnegut to cure the horrible disease of loneliness, something he claimed to be the #1 killer in America, one would need to rid themselves of this strict individualism and focus on building a community that shares similar values, hold similar goals, and generally want to help each other out simply because it helps the community. Now, of course, this is on a small scale, or at least he suggests it to be on a small scale. Each community of like-minded people working together both physically and mentally without an outside influence that would otherwise distort or collapse the intentions of the community. The relationships that we need to sustain from loneliness is more a spiritual aspect of being, and one of its biggest adversaries that halts this spiritual need is the ever-growing advancements of technologies. And his novel Player Piano addresses this throughout. Now I will leave it at that for now, but next week I do hope to explore some bigger themes in some of his more well-known works, and I do hope you can join me for that. So if you like this and want to see more content like this, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.